Well, this afternoon's panel is going to be a very exciting one that I'm actually been looking forward to moderating, because I know there's so much rich information to take away, and definitely it's going to actually add to myself as an educator in general as well. So we're going to be looking at radical Black homeschooling. My name is Dr. Richard Benson. I come to you all from Spelman College. In the fall, I'll actually be joining the Q team at the University of Pittsburgh. And my particular specializations look at radical Black education in the 60s and 70s, in addition to the pedagogy and also educational philosophies of Malcolm X, and also Malcolm X at Rice University. So again, it's a pleasure to join you all. Panelists, can you please do us a favor and introduce yourselves to our audience?
I'll start. My name's Stacey Akines. I'm located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm a home education supervisor of 2 children, one in the 4th and one in the 9th. We'll be starting the 4th grade in the fall. We'll be starting the 9th, and my other one will be starting the 9th. I started home educating in 2008 when my first son was born, because that's just upon birth is when home education starts. But I began documented home educating around 2008 when my eldest son entered the 4th grade. I'm also a moderator of Brown Mama's Homeschooling Facebook forum. And I'm also a 3rd year PhD student in the history department at Carnegie Mellon University, which is right across the bridge from Pitt. So I look forward to, I thank Q for inviting me as a panelist on this today, and I'm excited, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you.
I guess I can go. I'm Dr. Cheryl Fieldsmith from the University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia. I am a former elementary school teacher from the state of Connecticut, taught grades 1, 2, and 4, and had a lot of questions about what I was seeing in education, and decided to go back and pursue a PhD from Emory University under the direction of Vanessa Siddlewalker at Emory, and which changed my world and how I thought about everything that I was seeing. And now I teach future teachers, and I research. Initially, I started researching Black families' engagement in their education. And then I fell into, or was blessed with, this insight that Black families were homeschooling. And I've been researching it ever since 2006. I have 2 books out on the topic and another one that I'm working on now. And I'm just really excited to be here and very grateful for the invitation.
Thank you for joining us.
I can go next. My name is Walter Lewis. I am the president and CEO of the Homewood Children's Village. We're located in Pittsburgh, serving children and families who live in the Homewood and surrounding communities. Our mission is to improve the lives of Homewood's children and simultaneously reweave the fabric of the community in which they live. It's a mouthful, but we're trying to meet the needs of children today and also create the community context so that the children, all children in our community, can be successful and thrive. We largely look at education as a key lever in disrupting the cycle of generational poverty, which really brings us into this conversation. A couple of years ago, since our founding, we've always been looking at how do we best support the education of Black children. That's our community's 99% Black. How do we support the education of Black children? And so always looking for ways to do that. We did a lot of stuff in out of school time spaces. And I think particularly with the onset of the pandemic, started looking more into homeschooling and how we could support families who've already made that decision. How can we take the resources that we're putting into schools and provide some of those same resources to families who've made the decision to homeschool? It's also very personal for me because we also, as a family, made the decision to homeschool our oldest daughter during the pandemic. And so her last 2 years of high school, we homeschooled her. And so, that's sort of brought me full circle into the conversation, and also recognizing that there's a privilege to a degree that my family had, being able to make that decision, that many families in our community don't always have those necessary resources or the knowledge to make that leap. And so how do we take, again, the resources of an organization like the Village and other organizations in the community and make that more accessible to families in our community? And again, thank you everybody for being here, and definitely thank you, Q, for having this very important conversation.
So I'll go last. My name is Muffy Mendoza, and I am a former homeschooling parent. I homeschooled my 3 sons for 7 years, for a collective 7 years. And they are currently back in the school system. And my day job that I do when I'm not supporting their educational endeavors and whatever else they got going on is that I am the CEO and executive director, or that, I guess those are the 2 things, the founder and the CEO of Brown Mamas, which started out as a group of women meeting in my living room and is now an organization that supports Black mothers through positive socialization, programs, community events, all kinds of stuff. Just to, give my reason for homeschooling. I started homeschooling my kids because I didn't trust the school system. And I'm a huge advocate of homeschooling. I feel like all kids should be homeschooled up until a certain age. And just looking at my kids' experience in the schooling environment, still, homeschooling was hands down the best decision I could have ever made for my children. And it has given them such a beautiful foundation. And I'm so excited to share on this panel about how that happened.
Thank you, panelists, for introducing yourselves. And thank you for providing background, much needed for our audience who's going to be privy to a very important conversation and dialogue today. So let's just jump into it. Panelists, give us I would say kind of like the elevator spiel, if you had just a couple of minutes to talk to somebody about what homeschooling is. So tell us what this term means. And also, in addition to telling us, like, defining homeschooling, also tell us what you all would say that Black education homeschooling entails. So what are these 2 things parallel, and what are the points of divergence for these things in terms of homeschooling and Black education homeschooling? What would you say?
Okay, well, I'll start simply saying that homeschooling in general, to me, is a school choice option that provides parents or caregivers with the greatest amount of control and authority and decision-making in their children's education. And it can be accomplished in a variety of approaches and formats. But when Black people homeschool, there's something different going on. To me, Black homeschooling is a way of resisting, a way of overcoming, a way of beginning to heal from the educational injustices that we've had to endure for decades in this country. Students of color have experienced all kinds of, and continue to experience, based on the statistics, negative things, destructive things, anti-Blackness for one. I was on a session with James Anderson and the author of Fugitive Pedagogy, Dr. Givens. Mm-hmm. And James Anderson said, anti-Blackness is taught through education. Mm-hmm. So when we homeschool, it is a way for us to overcome this. It is a type of resistance. And I want to add, I recently met Nigerian Peters, who is a legal scholar out of the University of Kansas, or Kansas University, one of those 2. And she wrote a book, article, and it's titled The Rights to Be and Become, Black Home Educators as Child Privacy Protectors. Came out in 2019. I'm happy to share a copy with you. But in this article, she makes the case that privacy laws have been extremely well conceptualized as protection for the ability to live our lives as we choose, free from assault and any kind of invasion. However, her paper makes the case that privacy has not been sufficiently theorize, placed in connection with the racial discrimination that we experience in our childhood and onward. In her words, since I'm not getting my own today, she says, the ways in which radical discrimination strips Black people and therefore Black children of privacy rights and protections, and in the ways in which Black people reclaim and reshape those rights and protections remain a dynamic and fertile space ripe for exploration. So we need to talk about these rights to be and become. Homeschooling is an access for our children in particular, but families also, because it's a lifestyle, to have that privacy protection, to have the freedom to be and the freedom to become. And I'll be quiet because I could say a whole lot about that, but that is in a nutshell between the two.
Dr. Phil Smith, when you get an opportunity, can you drop the title of that book in the chat?
I will. Thanks
so much. I appreciate you. Panelists, what else we got for that question? Thanks for getting us started.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. I can only add to what she said because everything she said is everything that I would say. For my family, homeschooling was really about resistance and healing. When I realized that I was sending my children to a place and space where I didn't know these people, I didn't know not only, them as personal people, but I didn't know what their political beliefs were. I didn't know what their socioeconomic backgrounds were. I didn't know who their friends were and who was influencing them. It became very obvious to me that if I wanted to influence my children, I needed to spend more hours in the day with them. And that's what it really came down to. It was a numbers game. And my husband and I made the decision that we wanted to be the people who would spend the vast majority of time with our kids. So for us, homeschooling was about resistance. It was about quantity of time and quality of time. And it was also about healing. My son had spent, at that point when I started homeschooling my kids, my oldest son was entering the 6th grade. No, he was entering the 9th. Was he entering 8th or 9th grade? I think he was entering 8th grade. And we had already seen the effects of schooling on him and on our household, and how it was creating anxiety and it was creating tension in our household. And so that was the first thing that we noticed once all of our kids were home, was that there was such a release of tension. There was such a release of not having this outside external systemic factor constantly influencing how we engaged with each other on a day-to-day basis. And that in and of itself was worth it. And so it gave us kind of this insulated space with which to begin to heal those communicative and relational bonds between myself, my husband, and our oldest son. It gave us space to be able to begin to trust him in his explanations of things and in his dealings with other folks. Because when you are in a schooling system, it's pretty much your kid's word against the school's word. And so as an adult, you have to say to yourself, do I want to teach my child to be trusting of adults? Do I want to teach my child to respect adults, or do I want to trust my child? And so it just released us from having that dichotomy inside of our household. So for us, homeschooling, so much of homeschooling was about healing those relational bonds between myself, my husband, and our children, and beginning to help our children see, how important the family structure is in how you shift and shape your life. And again, I'll go back to the fact that my kids are back in school now, and there is such a vast difference between my children and the other kids. It's almost night and day. And I've even had teachers and administrators come to me and they're like, your kids are so dynamic. And I'm like, because they're not afraid, because they know they deserve trust. They know they deserve respect. So they walk into a room not thinking they're going to be distrusted, disrespected, and knowing how to own it for themselves. So it really gave us an opportunity to heal what was going on in our son and not pass those same trauma experiences down to our younger children.
I'll go next. As far as the definition of homeschooling, just for the public widely, there's a Eurocentric definition of that. And so it assumes that home is home, a house, where family, a middle-class family comes together, a white picket fence, a dining room, all kinds of spaces. And this definition has been pushed upon all other people who might even dream to homeschool. I just asked someone said, I would homeschool, but I don't have enough space, for example. So I was thinking, And so in even schooling, again, they just put the two words together. So the definition of schooling, what is that? So home and schooling come together, but scholars, and I am including, I'm sure Dr. Smith here, they don't agree on necessarily what it means just in a traditional homeschooling. So you have words used as home-based education, home education, which I personally like to use, unschooling, home-based learning. So there are different words that sometimes are used synonymously when you start reading articles in different papers, newspapers, whatever. But as far as Black homeschooling, I agree with Muffy, what she said, with Dr. Smith, what she said. It is definitely, the meaning of Black homeschooling comes from more or less the intention. So the intention is very different from what the traditional homeschoolers, or what have been labeled as traditional homeschoolers, have experienced. A lot of times we, especially mothers of boys, Black boys, it's essential that it happen. And I started homeschooling particularly in the 4th grade, at the beginning of the 4th grade, which I think many studies show that is a pivotal time for students in general. And so we started seeing the signs in my son. So I want to second what Muffy said about the family dynamics, second what Dr. Smith said about the privacy. And then I want to add my own as far as Black spirituality. I think that is a big part of our community that has been just relegated to the sidelines when it comes to the public schooling system in America, when they separate kind of like church and state, or whatever it's called, that apparatus that removes spirituality from the daily lives of children. And so particularly on my familial experience, since we have like 5 prayers a day, that was very, very complicating to teach our children our habits, our ritualistic habits or spiritual habits. And as far as sometimes we have different holidays, have different foods that we eat or choose not to eat. And with free lunch and public schooling systems and these things, it was a plethora of logistical problems that the school system presented itself with. But as far as family and the tightness and the closeness of siblings, being able to grow up with their siblings and spend time with their siblings, because the school system segregates ages. So if you have, like my children are 5 years apart, one might go to one school while the other one goes to another school. And so they're learning different environments, and they're in different environments one day, all day. So that's just what I like to add. But yes, the intention of Black homeschooling affects the meaning and the definition of Black homeschooling.
And if I could jump in, again, I'm riding on with everything that's already been said. But I want to pick on something, and can I call you Dr. Stacey? Because we're gonna claim that, because that's about to happen. What she just said around, I forget how you started off, but the word that jumped out to me when I think about homeschooling, the definition is freedom. And both from like a liberatory sense for Black people, right? Allowing us to achieve liberation, but also in your ability to educate and to learn. I mean, that was the most powerful thing that I saw. Like, COVID was crazy because you had all of these kids learning at home, but there was no real ability to shape their education. So my child is sitting next to me all day long, but there was no way to help empower their learning, right? Because that was already created by all of these other people. And then all of a sudden we started homeschooling my eldest child because we didn't like what was happening with her particular school. And all of a sudden we were free. I mean, like the level of restrictions are so minimal. I mean, you look at the state standards and you're trying to make sure that your kids are on track and they're learning all of those things. But beyond that, there were no rules and real bounds to how you would achieve that. And so for the first time in her life, we were able to really shape education around her. So much of education, it's like we're designing something for everyone, which we know we aren't really everyone, right? Mm-hmm. When that's being designed. And so we're often left out in terms of the design of it. But now you can create something for your child and make sure that they're getting the things that they're getting. And it gets so deep because, I mean, you were talking about scholars don't even agree on the definition of homeschooling. We're still debating even like what should education do? What should it produce? What are those qualities? And so again, in the traditional schooling environment, if we're still debating that, odds are your child's not going to get what your version is or your expectations for the educational outcomes. But all of a sudden, when you homeschool, you have the freedom to choose and to decide that. And it's just such a powerful thing. And again, I think for Black people, that freedom is even more powerful for us because it's not just like personal choice or convenience. I mean, we're literally talking about, in some cases, life and death, the things that we're able to educate our children on and the things we're able to educate them out of. And I love what the sisters were saying earlier around starting early. We got started late in our journey, but to sort of not ever have to have your children introduced to some of these harmful concepts, it is such a powerful thing that, you know, so I just, freedom is the word that jumps out to me.
So freedom, actually, Dr. Phil Smith, one of the first words that jumped out for me as you began explaining and providing your response, you used resistance. I've heard freedom from each and every one of you, and I've heard freedom and resistance used like oscillating back and forth, using these terms interchangeably. So the thing that keeps coming to mind as you all are speaking is homeschooling, but I'm thinking of homeschooling as a maroon activity, as a resistance activity. That said, as we all know who've, you know, done even slight investigations on Black life globally, understand that, you know, that's been a anti-colonial, anti-imperialist practice. And given that, the historical meanings and also intentions around education have also meant something very, very, you know, particular, whether it's James Anderson's work, who's spoken to it, Vanessa Siddle Walker's, V.P. Franklin, Du Bois, Chris Spann. I mean, there have been a number of people who've spoken to ed being, you know, being in fugitivity with respect to the practices and also it being liberatory. So I must ask you, especially because I'm a history junkie, what do you all find homeschooling on the historical continuum of Black education? And I'll say radical Black education. What do you find it on the historical continuum? Where do you place it? Where do you find it? Where do you place it? Yeah.
I think for me, and I'm not as deep into the scholarship as some of the other folks that are on the panel. So that's why I went first. That's why I'm going first. But for me, I mean, as far as my read of history, it seems like this is where we started, right? Like when I think about my understanding is folks taught me about what education looked like in our communities pre Brown v. Board, right? When, you know, we were educated. I mean, we had these multiple age groups in the same places. A lot of the educators were from the community. So, okay, they may not have been in my house, right? But it was in my community with people that I know me, that know my family. So it was very much this home community style of education. And so for me, a lot of it seems like, again, when Black people are talking about homeschooling, we're in many ways returning to earlier concepts that we were already doing and that were having the same kinds of outcomes that we're starting to see today. Like when you had kids coming out that were confident. I mean, you had Black kids coming out of those educational environments, going to some of these most quote unquote prestigious institutions in the country and in the world and thriving. but they came out of what was supposed to be bad schools, right? But they were educated in this style of education. So to me, it seems to be something that we're returning to in terms of the sort of historical context.
Mm-hmm.
I just like to just say that when we first started homeschooling, we named our school. So the name of our school is the School of the Maroons. And so when we named our school that, that was the first lesson. What does this mean?
Mm-hmm.
And so I had to teach them who the Maroons were, we're withdrawing, we're waiting, we will swoop down if a revolution happens, be leaders, help out those who need to be rescued. And so yes, homeschooling has a part of maroonage. It definitely comes from that concept of maroonage, fugitivity. I think on the historical placement of it, as far as in a radical tradition, it is there. It might not be as widely known or accepted because it hasn't turned into a mass movement yet. And that's when the pushback will probably come. But we're sitting here saying that, you know, Black homeschooling, and homeschooling again is the legal term of which the government has. Home education, Black education, is a political statement. And so when you look back at the Garvey movement in the 1920s, you can look at Carter G. Woodson around the turn of the century, and even before on enslaved communities. The education that they pursued outside of the master's eyes, even if they had to go to a river and learn how to read. The legality of true Black education has always been in question, has always been, is it legal to truly politically educate Black people within the boundaries of the United States? And now that globalization is here, is it truly, can we educate Black people worldwide? And so I think Black homeschooling is really the closest to the radical tradition that we have in schooling right now. We still do have Black independent schools, but as far as being able to connect your Black education politically, without having to endure the constant testing and under the government or the mainstream eye, you don't have to be subjected to that. It goes back to what Dr. Field Smith was saying about the privacy issue. You have that privacy to teach your kids transnational political education, if you so choose to, which will not be allowed in the public schooling system. So I think Black homeschooling in itself might be considered radical, but it is the traditional education that Black people have had since upon arrival, upon the indigenous Blacks of this country being dispossessed in order to survive. It is the traditional education of Blacks in this country.
I absolutely agree with you. Everything that you've said, through homeschooling or home education, Black families are doing exactly what we've always had to do in our educational system, but we have new ways of doing it. And I just like to say one of the things, the minute you start to study African-American education in particular, one of the things that you find is that we have never been truly a monolithic group. Even when we were supposedly we weren't all pushing to get into public schools during integration, right? Some of us were trying to fight to keep our Black schools. Some of us put our children into parochial schools to get away from it all. So we do different things, and we find the same thing in this Black homeschool movement, such as it is, that there are demographic differences in who's homeschooling. There's pedagogical differences, ideological differences. So we are a diverse group when we talk about Black home educators, just like we've always been diverse. I mean, always have been diverse, but related to our history, I have a chapter called Ancestors, from Our Ancestors to Today, right? And I talk about what you're talking about. We've always resisted and had to resist. The difference today with the maroonage is that we're in plain sight. That's a different part of it. It's legal. we're taking what we have access to and making it work for our children, for our families, which is, and we're doing it in plain sight. That's it's amazing to me that we can do. I'm glad that we're taking advantage of that. To me, the Black homeschooling it's a resistance movement, and it's a continuation of that legacy of self-determination. When you talk about single mothers that choose to homeschool and they forego their full-time employment, that's self-determination. When you speak to those single mothers, why are they doing this? Because this is what is best for my children. It's a sacrifice. It's a giving up of your career. Even if you have a two-parent family, the minute that mom, usually it's the mom, sacrifices her career for the family, and they go from being what would have been maybe a middle-class family to a working-class family. Now they've got to keep the car a little bit longer. They can't replace that furniture as when it breaks down, but it's a sacrifice, and we've always had to sacrifice. I think placing it on our history too, I think about, it would be totally remiss not to talk about the late, great Bell Hooks's concept of home place, where she wrote historically what was happening in those homes during the Jim Crow era, that the children would come home and they would hear, Black is beautiful, you are smart, we are capable. They're taught all the knowledge that they need in order to overcome and counter the hatred they faced the minute they left their doors. And that concept was called home place by Bell Hooks. Well, homeschooling is extending home place. It's reprioritizing home place, remembering that this is what we have to do as parents. Black homeschooling is activism. It's an everyday activism thing. And the book I'm working on now, the tentative title is Creating Our Own Educational Justice, because I see Black homeschoolers as they're taking it in their own hands and doing what we have to do in order to get our children to be able to go where they need to go. So like our ancestors who escaped slavery, homeschooling, yes, is a type of maroonage, but it's in plain sight. So that's new. And it provides a safe harbor for our children. And it's those radicalized, racialized experiences that occur in schools don't have a hold on our children anymore. That's the liberation part, that we can choose to pour into them what's wonderful about being Black, and all the things that make us wonderful, and being able to overcome that. It's so necessary. It's absolutely necessary. We're doing what is necessary. In my studies, I've at this point, I've talked to over 70 Black homeschool families around the nation, and only about 12 to 13 of those chose to homeschool from birth. The other ones, the majority, they left traditional schools. Sometimes it could be public or private. They've left Christian schools, they've left public schools, they left charter schools, all types of schools that have failed their children. But the ones that left the traditional schools, what's unique is they didn't choose to homeschool. That wasn't their first choice. Home education is their second choice. It came out of a need. It was a necessary decision to give their children the best that they could do, they could offer them. And understanding that as Black parents, they could do a better job than these traditional schools, public or private.
Thank you for that, Dr. Smith. I wanted to just add the word deschooling to the conversation, because I think that's basically what's happening. I actually hate the term homeschooling, because that's not what I did with my kids. It didn't fit. And when we talk about historically, I think what Black people have been forced to do historically is to deschool, is to reprogram ourselves in the midst of all of the racism, classism, isms that we're dealing with, both in the education system, but also within our communities themselves. And when I think about what I was trying to do with my children, I just think about curiosity. That's what led our day to day was curiosity, what I was curious about, what they're curious about.
Mhm.
And when I think about just even from a historical perspective, my own educational experience and my mother's educational experience and my grandmother's educational experience, there was always this process of deschooling that had to happen once you hit your house door. Because your parents knew what you were facing at school. They knew that you were facing distrust. They knew that you were facing all of the isms. They knew that you were facing low self-esteem and all those things that kids have to deal with. And so I just think about the fact that Black people have always deschooled. We deschooled when we got done in the fields with the masters. We deschooled when we came from across these shores and had to make sense of what was happening, not only in the motherland at that time, but also when we were on those slave boats. So I think that's just the process of what we're doing. And then just bringing it all the way forward. When I watch my kids and their friends, they deschool every day with technology. Technology has become such a form of resistance for Black children. It is how they get away from all the craziness that they cannot understand. I watch my kids create relationships with kids in Florida and in Korea on Minecraft. And this is a way that they are deschooling and deprogramming themselves from having to deal with all the lines that exist that separate people from people. So I just wanted to introduce that term to the conversation because I think that's just what Black folks do. We deschool because we know that the systems that are in place in our communities are not for us.
Colleagues, you all have added much to the conversation in terms of talking about the political and historical. Let me ask you all this. Do you all feel that there are socioeconomic factors or variables that contribute to why it is that parents and guardians choose to homeschool? Or do you think that's something that may not necessarily be as high on the list of priorities as it relates to the political and historical factors? What are your thoughts on that?
It's very high. It's
Okay.
very high on the list of things that people decide. I think that there are some rare folks like Stacey who are able to be a single parent and homeschool. But for the vast majority of folks, I know whenever I've talked to parents about homeschooling, they always say, I'm a single parent. How can I do this? Now, I've had some really courageous moms join me who were single moms on the homeschooling journey, but I can honestly say for myself, and I always only speak for experience for myself because I am not a doctor. I'm not even in school for this. It's just what I did for my kids. But when I speak from my own personal experiences, I know that had I not had a husband with an income, and that don't mean we didn't struggle because we struggled immensely because we only had one income, and my husband did not graduate from college. So we definitely struggled a lot to homeschool because it was something we did because we knew we had to do it for our kids, not because we were financially prepared. But had we not had that other income coming in, I'm not sure we would have made it to year 3 or year 4 because we would have needed the income. And I do see more now that there are more Black parents homeschooling. I do see other parents like, oh, I know I can do this. I know that there are other ways online I can make money. I know that there are other ways I can be dependent upon my community. But something that I've talked about with other parents is like when you homeschool, you got to be open to the fact as a Black person that you might be on food stamps, that you might need medical assistance. You might need all of those things. Because I know we did when we were homeschooling our kids, and we're a 2-parent household. So the socioeconomic thing is definitely in the background, determining how or who participates in this thing called homeschooling. But also, I think as we continue to, build these systems of supports, that'll become less of a concern. Because at the end of the day, I know that there are, especially in cities outside of Pittsburgh, there are a lot of homeschooling co-ops where people are sharing resources and they're finding ways to make sure that, everybody's needs are met because we know the children are the future. And if we don't protect them, then, what exactly is the plan here?
Yeah, second everything Muffy said. I think absolutely, it's a critical factor. I mean, it's part of the reason why as a Children's Village, as an organization, we wanted to try to figure out what are ways that we can use our resources to support families who make that decision or who are on the fence and want to make that decision. They feel like it's the best thing for their child, but they don't feel like they have the resources to make that happen. So again, how do we leverage our resources and supports? Because we're hearing the same thing, like particularly during the pandemic, so many families were talking about their dissatisfaction with the quality of education for their children, just lots of different things that they were sharing with us, but didn't feel like they could, participate in any type of education, like homeschooling or any type of learning at home. And so I 100% agree. And then again, when I talk about sort of the privilege of my family, like, we were in a pandemic, I had a job that, I was able to do remotely and, able to make that kind of stuff work. Again, my wife was able to do some of the same kinds of stuff, was able to walk away from her job and, to start that. Everybody doesn't have that setup to be able to even do that. And so just recognizing that while this is such a great resource, it's not available to everybody, certainly not equitably.
I definitely agree. And as one who researches homeschooling among Black families, one of the things that surprised me was when I looked at the demographics. The first study, I had 46 families represented. Now, you would think that this would be the elite people with the highest education, the greatest amount of wealth, and that was not the case. In that initial study, I had 7 single mothers. The majority of the people represented in those 46 families had some education or an undergraduate degree. Only 4 of those families had advanced degrees, meaning a law degree or a PhD or some kind of medical doctor. These were common everyday folks making a decision on behalf of their children to homeschool, to, like I said, to go without that brand new car or new furniture. Actually had an experience of a child opened a door, welcomed me in for the interview, and she had me sit down on the sofa and I sank all the way to the floor. And the mother came in and said, well, now you know one of the perils of homeschooling. We can't afford new furniture. I mean, and I understand. We, when you look at the economic research that shows, I think PBS did a special where you have a white man and a Black man, the same level of education, the same job, the same income, the same everything. Yet that white man has more wealth because of his family, the value of his home is higher value than the white person, than the Black person, that kind of thing. Those things haven't gone away. And so it makes it harder for us to homeschool. But I'm here to tell you that based on my research, parents are deciding, even with this social economic hurdle, they are making it work because they have to. They recognize they have to. One of the things that helps is they're not alone. They're not at the kitchen table by themselves doing this work. They do it in community. They have, brothers and sisters who are homeschooling, and they meet together, they support one another, they share resources, they teach together, they do field trips together, they plan together sometimes. And so it goes back to our history. We're self-taught, but it's a communal self-taught, right? I'm not alone doing this. And that's part of what makes it possible. And then, of course, you see the difference in your children. Everybody I talk to in my interviews, I always ask about the Common Core or the state curriculum. Where does that fit in your thinking? And look at Muffy shaking her head. That's what they do. Nope, because these Common Core and standards, this is beneath what we do. We've already done this. We're going forward. It's not enough. Those standards are not enough to capture what I need to do with my children. I do more, infinitely more than this with my children. So And then in my head now, I'm thinking about, I teach teachers and I'm teaching a group right now. Next week, I will be teaching them the role of those Common Cores in their lesson planning. And I have to convince them that this represents the bare minimum of what you must teach your children. And it is the hardest thing to convince them because it seems so overwhelming. I mean, they need to talk to the parents, right? That's what my third book is about, how these things talk to each other. You've got parents doing more. And it's not because they have fewer children, because sometimes they send their children to these, online classes or to co-ops to be in groups, taught in classes. Sometimes they go to homeschool schools, if you will, these micro schools and things like that. So it's possible to do more than what those standards, require of us. I think it's just really, really important to recognize that the social economic factors, I agree with Muffy that they're going to become less and less of a problem, less and less of a barrier. In fact, we're seeing new careers. So homeschool, home educators can become consultants to the next generation and make a living that way. I've met home educating Black moms who have developed their own curriculum, and they sell that. And they also hire people to teach that curriculum so that people can sign up for classes. And it's like an online school where a Black home educating mom has this curriculum. She's hired and trained teachers, and people pay to be taught by them. We see homeschool schools popping up and independent schools. I know at least, numerous people that are homeschooling, opening up new ways of getting children educated by opening up independent schools. So the possibilities are endless for what can happen here to overcome these social economic barriers.
I just wanted to jump in real quick and say if you just take the social, for example, barriers, a lot of the barriers we have come from the traditional definition of homeschooling. So again, it goes back to being middle class, white, American. And so here we are thinking, oh, you have to have that kitchen table, watch your husband make his lunch, he goes off to work, and now it's you by yourself at the table in this traditional American family setting. And like Dr. Smith says, a lot of times it is the female or the woman that homeschools in our family. It's just really, I don't know what's traditional or not. This is where research has to be done, because I think in Black families, we're going to see those males there present, because we're taking our boys out of school and they have to have that male interaction. That's one of the reasons why the public schooling system doesn't work in a sense for particularly Black boys, is because they don't have as much of a Black male influence systematically, not just one there that's the enforcer, but across the board. And so we homeschool as a family, we homeschool as a community. And so a lot of people, when I say, yeah, we homeschool, it's kind of like I homeschool, it goes all to me, but that's just not true. You see me with the kids in the day, but sometimes school doesn't start until 6 p.m. at night when you're out there in the middle of the woods, building a campfire with dad. And so and a lot of times it's portrayed like, because like Muffy said, I'm married, she's married, it might be, oh, only married couples homeschool. Not true, as Dr. Phil Smith has written the book on it, finally. Single parents, single males, single females, home education is accessible to anyone, especially now that I think COVID allowed it to be a sampler. And so some people had a good experience, some people had a bad experience, but I think it allowed it to be a sampler, because right then you didn't really have a choice. It didn't matter if you were single or what socioeconomic background you came from. You experienced it for that moment in time. And so the social part does have a lot. I agree with Muffy, has a lot to do with it. People say, well, this is my circumstance. And that goes back to what Walter was saying about building those community structures, because if the tighter our community becomes, the more resources we have, it will just open up doors for people who know, hey, I might be single, my grandma might have passed away, or all my family support, but I have, again, my community support. So I think social factors, economic, of course, but because just traditionally Black people have been from a working class, little lower than what we consider middle class. And so that factors in when you need to work. What do you do with your kids while you're at work? Where will they get their education from? So I agree with everything everyone said.
Panelists, thank you all for your responses. I'm going to pull a quote from a piece that was written last year, almost to the date, so June 14th, 2021 in the New Yorker magazine. This article, Dr. Phil Smith, who joins us today, also contributed to this article brilliantly. And the excerpt that I'm going to pull that I want you to comment to, it simply states that most of the parents told Phil Smith that the decision had been wrenching. Winning access to public education was one of the most central victories of the civil rights movement. Several parents had relatives who saw homeschooling as a slap in the face to the legacy of Brown v. Board education. Others worried about harming their neighbors' children because public schools rely on per pupil funding from state governments. In 2020, around 70% of Detroit public school revenues came from per student allocations by the state. So for any of you who want to comment on this, I definitely want to get your feedback. I want to open a question up first and foremost to Dr. Phil Smith, who contributed to that piece that was in the New Yorker. What do you all feel about that quote in terms of it being a betrayal or slap in the face as they speak to homeschooling? What do you think about that? Dr. Phil Smith, get us started on this, please.
Okay, I want to first say this is one of the challenges of, being interviewed by journalists. They can't tell, but it's all the story. They can only tell part of it.
Right, and they took that little bitty piece.
Yeah.
And you was going back reading it, you was like, wait a minute, but I didn't say, right, exactly.
So I would say what is true is early in my research, so 2006, 2007, 2008, those first 46 families, one of the common themes was that their moms and dads were in education, or they had family members that were in education. And when they made the decision in the early 2000s, or even in the late 1990s, to homeschool their children, that the fact that we've always looked to brick and mortar public schools to homeschool, it may have appeared as a slap in the face to those families. Maybe the Black grandmoms and grandpops, if you will, who had integrated their schools during Brown or after Brown in the 70s in the South. And so they were still beholden to those brick and mortar buildings. But I see that less of that now. When I interview people in studies now, I hear less of that. So it seems to me the home education movement among Black families has become more normalized, if you will. It's becoming more normalized. People are beginning to understand. Last month, I got a Spencer Foundation conference grant to begin a Black homeschool researchers group. And we had a chance to come together face to face this past May. And one of the researchers brought her father with her. This father used to be a principal. He was a Black leader in education, an educator in his community in Tennessee. And he started off with us the first night of the conference. I don't agree with what you're doing, but I'm just here to learn and listen, that kind of thing. And he kept saying
that. How you really feel.
That's how, yeah, I was like, okay. And we had our dialogue going, and then he presented with, he is home educating his grandchildren with his daughter, who is a professor, happens to be a professor, and talking about what he does from a distance, I might add. And by the end of that conference, he said to me, you know what? I understand what you all are doing and why you're doing it. I get it. It's not like it used to be. And I'm like, that's right. I think the other thing we have to think about with this quote is, we have multiple facets of our history. Yes, some of us were pushing. Yes, we desegregated these schools. We got into these schools, but we all know, and even some of our educational leaders warned us, that this was not the integration we wanted. Our desires, our hopes and dreams for desegregation have not been realized. We know that. And so that's the piece, right? I hear when talking to Black homeschool folks that a lot of empathy and understanding for what the traditional school teacher has to go through today, the stress that is placed on them. They understand the misdirected focus on test scores instead of actual learning. The damaging conditions like large class sizes, bullying, and the overall lack of respect for what teachers do. All of that has an impact on children's learning environments. But Black homeschool parents, many of them wish that the traditional schools would work for their children. But how long should they wait? If I think I can do something better for my children, I have the right to make that decision and to do that, right? So, and I want to even add this piece. Even when a family decides to homeschool, what I find, that Black homeschool family or deschooling family, I like that language, Black deschooling family, serves their community. They benefit their community in many ways. Sometimes these parents are serving on school councils. They attend school board meetings. They tutor traditionally schooled children. And I even have met these deschooling families. They serve on the board of education for their local communities. So they still serve in that capacity. They care about the community. They are very much working on behalf of public schools in many ways, even though they have chosen this deschooling path for their children. So it's there's a lot more to that quote than appears. Yeah.
Panelists, give me just the latitude to step out of the moderated role for just a brief moment or whatever. I really want to interject something, because when I read the quote, it pissed me off. So I'm just being frank, because essentially, I think, it's in terms of talking about the nuanced history that you're speaking to, Dr. Fieldsmith, essentially, I think people want to romanticize a period in terms of what they would have thought that it looked like, or were told that it looked like, or felt that it may have looked like, without necessarily thinking about it from an aerial, or I would say a broader view. And the thing that just kept coming to mind in that particular moment was, it's like, okay, folks forget what white supremacy actually did after Brown v. Board, when they were so upset that folks wanted to be in school next to what it is that they thought was going to be their future or their children's future through the educative process, and shut down schools all over the country. So you had Prince George's, or was it Prince Edward's County that was in Virginia? I mean, them folks actually invented the voucher system so they could go to religious-based schools by shutting down public ed for 3 years, forcing you to homeschool or learn at home, even if you wanted to be in a brick and mortar. That's one of the first things I'm thinking of. In addition to that, to your point, Charles Hamilton Houston's initial strategy for integration was an economic one, not a physical one. They needed a victory. And I think people forget those things. I just wanted to interject those two things. And I'm going to be quiet because I get to talking too much and I'm moderating today. So let me go back to our regular scheduled programming. So good people, what else do we have on this? This slap in the face perspective, this so-called betrayal perspective. And thank you for getting us started, Dr. Fieldsmith. What do you all think about this? What are your thoughts?
I was thinking on the lines of you, Dr. Benson. I was like, this is why we need adult education. I believe Black homeschooling or Black education begins with adult education, because kids can't just walk out of school and say, I'm getting homeschooled now, sign up for it. It takes an adult, a parent in the state of Pennsylvania, or a guardian, because every state has different laws. Because I hear Dr. Phil Smith talking about all this, like homeschool schools, illegal in Pennsylvania. It's like, so we have one of the strictest states in the country as far as homeschooling regulation is concerned. But it goes back to adult education, because when someone says something to me like that, I think about Brown too. And so just being the historian, I'm like, okay, let's talk about the legacy of Brown 2, which Brown 1, we all know, said that separate but equal could never be attained. So it outlawed desegregation. Well, 1 year later, in 1955, the Brown 2 case was deliberated on when should desegregation happen? Should it happen now? Do we take our time? Well, the court ruled that it should happen with, and I quote, all deliberate speed. Okay, so if we take the word deliberate and you add some synonyms there, let's say intentional speed. And as Dr. Benson was saying, the intentions were never to desegregate. So with all intentional speed, with all deliberate speed, it never happened. To this day, schools in the United States of America were not fully desegregated or integrated. So that is the legacy of Brown 1, not Black homeschoolers. We're not slapping it in the face. Brown 2, 1 year later, 1955, slapped it in the face. And so I just, like I said, and it was known by scholars at the time. It was known by scholars at the time. So I just think that if I just leave with a quote of W.E.B. Du Bois, where he says, in 1954, the same year of the Brown versus Board of Education 1, many Americans seem to think that this settles the problem of Negro education. There is a sense in which we may say that it merely begins it, because in the separate Negro schools, many things were done which will not be done immediately or even for a long time in integrated public schools without great struggle. That was W.E.B. Du Bois in 1954.
Yeah, I'm with you. And then when I think about Brown, it's personal for me because my family's from Somerton, South Carolina. And those of you familiar with the history of Brown, that first case was right out of Somerton, South Carolina, Briggs versus Elliott. And so like I always heard the stories of how they were excited and trying to do something, but then again, what happened in that local town and how, again, they shut down schools, all the white kids left the schools, they still defunded the schools. And so literally we're still back in the same spot. And to your point, Stacey, has not changed to this day when you look at the state of our schools. And so, yeah, it's not that homeschooling or anything we're doing is slapping anybody in the face. It is what this country has done to our children. And I mean, I always find this question troubling to me because it seems when people say things like this, everything but the child, the young person that we're talking about is at the center. And so for me, ultimately, it is about the education of children. Children should be in environments where they can be educated to the fullest of their potential and ability. And that should be the end of the conversation. If you think that this brick and mortar public school can do that best, and that's what the family and the child thinks, okay, we can have a conversation. But we should never be shutting down an option simply because it reroutes funding or does something that we don't like as adults, if it is in fact what's best for young people. And that's what I always talk about. Like in Pittsburgh, the conversation hasn't largely been about homeschooling. It's been about charters and other options versus public. And the thing that I always say to people is I, as a leader and as a community person, I am never going to stand in the way of what a parent thinks is best for their child's education. And I don't think any of us have the right to do so, right? As an individual parent, nobody's going to stand in the way of what I think is best for my child. I put my child in the educational environment I think is best for them. And to me, that's what the conversation should always be about, is how are we helping to educate our young people? And really the conversation should end there. So again, and I think anything that's not that is what's a slap in the face to our young people. How dare we as adults place them in environments where they're not able to learn, not able to grow, not able to thrive, and call that education and call that learning.
I'll end by just saying that I think this has a lot to do with Black people's inability to see the value within, and the fact that a lot of times we don't, we are so used to being given freedom that we don't understand how to take freedom. And so when you present us with the obstacle of taking freedom, oftentimes we back out of it using historical context. And so we have to begin to recognize when an opportunity is staring us in the face, and we have to utilize our own pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps in order to get out of it. And education is one of those things. It is one of those things where, like Dr. Smith said, it's happening in plain sight. In plain sight, Black people can remove themselves from a system, create their own community to educate our children. This is a gift. This is a gift that, quite honestly, if white folks knew what it was hitting for, they would have sold up years ago. But since they know Black people don't understand our own value and don't understand our own ability to create for ourselves and take freedom, what do? We call it a slap in the face. No, this is a loophole, honey. This is how millionaires become millionaires. They find tax loopholes and they exploit them. This is an educational loophole, and Black people need to recognize that this is one of the many ways we talk about economics as being how we are going to get ourselves out of this racist debacle we have ourselves in. No, family is the answer. And we know that families are being divided on a day-to-day basis, not just by economics, but by this education system. I was in awe of how peaceful my home was within 3 months of pulling my kids out of school. The arguments that stopped, the clarity of communication between me and my children, the ways in which me and my husband began to say, well, if our kids don't have to, then we don't have to. What can we begin to do for ourselves since we are now doing this one thing? Education, pulling our kids out of school and starting that journey of deschooling, which was the first thing we did, was understanding that education, I always like to say, and I got this from several people, I kind of just put it together, but education has nothing to do with learning. Nothing. Education is the means by which we transmit our societal norms to other folks, little folks, because they're the most impressionable. Learning is what happens when a person gets curious. Learning is what happens when a person deduces the values, the systems, the opportunities in their lifestyle and says, aha, this thing here is a way. There's some sunshine there. Let me go towards it. And so when we talk about all these historical laws and narratives that have been created for Black people and how getting away from that is a slap in the face, no, it's a slap in the face that we haven't learned nothing from these white folks who've been existing in front of our eyes for the last 400, 500 years damn near. What are we going to learn from them? What they teach us every day is that you have to learn to play the system. And the system says, if you don't want your kids to go to school, you don't got to send them. That's like kindergarten stuff. You don't want your kids to exist in an environment where they're not being trusted, where they're not being liberated, where their learning is being stifled, where they're being disrespected. The amount of disrespect that I've witnessed in public school systems between adults and children is ridiculous and disgusting. So you don't want your children to be there. This is a loophole. Take them out. I'll smack anybody in the face if it means I'm going to get my kids into an environment where they feel liberated, where they can learn on their own agenda, and where I can be the one to interpret life for them versus a white female teacher who has been placed in this environment by those very laws, because we don't talk about the teachers union enough, and how the teachers union was actually the white female run teachers union was actually the one that most benefited from all of those laws. So I think we just, as Black people, we have to recognize when we are the stifling factor. And this is one of the cases where oftentimes we are the stifling factor, because we really, really, really for whatever insane reason, believe that white folks are looking out for us, and they ain't.
Tell us how you really feel. Thank you.
Oh, everybody knows that's how I feel. That is not a problem.
I get it. I'm catching up, no doubt. I have a Dream Keepers, Dream Killers, Spirit Killers question for you all, because I want to ask about the psychosocial. You all have talked so much about how the attitudes, the general dispositions, the cognitive development, the general outlook, the ability to be able to communicate, exchange with your young people who've experienced schooling and learning in a different format have looked. And I come to this question using El-Haj Malik El-Shabazz Malcolm X as a case study. And I think it's important to put such a life in a context, especially with the quote that he gave us years ago that said, only a fool would allow his enemy to teach his children. And with that statement, he essentially is speaking to his childhood, in addition to what took place in terms of him and his brothers and sisters being ward to the state after his mother was institutionalized. So he's speaking to what it is that took place, obviously the Ostrovsky moment, when he was told that a nigga can never be a lawyer, your people will never hire you, obviously my people will never hire you, in addition to what took place in terms of the overall declination of his life after that moment. So he's speaking to this moment of diseducation and miseducation that he experienced at the hands of what it is that he termed later on in life as, his enemy. My question to you all, with that being the preface, what do you all feel are the psychosocial stakes that are, I would say the most palpable in terms of how it is and why it is that you've chosen to embark upon this quest of homeschooling and home education, home-based education? What are the psychosocial factors that are most at stake for your children and your young people?
Well, I'll start out by saying one of the main reasons why I started homeschooling was because I noticed that my son at the time, he didn't believe I knew anything. And so the psychological part is that all in my situation, I went to his school, it was a chartered school, it had one Black female teacher. And so the people who had been teaching him since kindergarten did not look like me, did not come from the same background as I did nothing. And so psychologically, he was being taught that the only person that could teach you looks like this, talks like this, walks like this, has hair like this, dresses like this, and drives a car like this. And so that was a major problem for me personally. It didn't take long, because once they're homeschooled, if you have to, as Muffy said, kind of de-school that process out. But that was one of them. He was so young when I took him out. He wasn't going through the security checks every day that we noticed at school. I went up to the school the other day, and it was like, added on to the security checks, they have these little thermometers that they point right at their head, just like this. And it's like a scanner in a grocery store. And so, yeah, it's fast, but I'm just saying, psychologically, to be stopped every morning before you walk into the place that you're about to sit 8 hours or do whatever it is for, 8.5 hours. It just impacts a child to the point where, like Muffy was saying earlier, when adults see my children and see how they behave towards each other, towards other human beings, they are like, wow, what school do they go to? They just don't understand the social impact, even the mind impact. Even my kids, when they encounter school kids, sometimes they say, well, why did they do that? Why did they say this? Why did they act like, what's wrong with my shoes? Or whatever. They have no concept of these things that psychologically go on in school. So, and socially, the social part is for me, and then I'll end on this, but I choose how my kids are socialized. So that is one of the biggest questions as a homeschooling family that I get. Well, what about their socialization? And no one asked the school about that. No one asked these schools when they drop their kid out, oh, how are my kids being socialized? Well, they're being taught that a white female is the only person who can teach them. A Black male will be the person who penalizes them, because a lot of these schools in our area have it enforcer, that's what I call them, but they're some type of social mediator. And
Overseer.
and then they have security guards at the door, or some in fact have police stations located at their school. And so this is how they're being socialized. But in fact, as a homeschooling parent, the social part, so I've already talked about the psychological part, but the social part is that I choose to say, okay, we're going to go play chess today at this location, at the Homewood Chess Club, for example. This is a social environment that I choose to put my kids in and see how they socialize. And they have one moment, 1 or 2 hours, and then we can say, well, how did you feel about that? We can debrief them when we get home. If it felt good, they want to go back, and they choose. There's the liberation part. They choose to go back. They say, Mom, yeah, I liked it. I made some friends. And that's a major difference.
I just think, one thing that it comes to my mind is just like understanding and appreciating their inherent value as people and young Black people. That, like, it's funny, like in a homeschool environment, you don't even always have to like intentionally do anything, right? Just being in the environment, loving on your children, talking with them, laughing with them, they get that confidence. But sometimes we send them into these spaces and that's not what they get. And because they're in these spaces for so long, sometimes they develop this sort of, confusion around, like, where are they valued? Are they valuable? Who determines my value? And one of the things is funny as we're having this conversation, I didn't even think about this that deeply before now, but one of the things that all of my kids, my youngest ones, have benefited from is they went to quote unquote Grammy school for their early childhood education. And so, and my mother was at first very like apprehensive, like, I'm not a teacher, but we worked with her, created, structures and all of that kind of stuff that we wanted them to experience. And, they, my two that have gone into school, again, some of the things that Muffy and Stacey, you talked about, people saying about your kids, folks are like, oh, your kids are this or that or what have you. But I think one of the greatest things was that inherent sense of value that you get when you're around your people and people that love you. And again, while that's not impossible to experience in these other environments, it's definitely something that happens when they're with you and with people that they love. And so I think, like, socially, that was one of the most powerful and impactful things, because when you feel valued and you value yourself, it sort of sets the precedent and the foundation for everything you do after that. All of a sudden, like, I can become this or I can become that. I can work hard. I can do all of these things. And again, I think that starts in the home environment when we're able to pour more of that energy into our young people.
So for me, it's really about finding, because American schools do a great job of making our children into individualistic, materialism, ego-led people. And so for me, it's a lot of it is about allowing the communal to define the individual, and for the individual to find their place in the community as an autonomous, independent being, but understanding their value to the community simultaneously, while understanding the importance of self-identity. So for my kids, it was a lot about just helping them to be really firm in the fact that when they go out into the world, they don't just represent themselves. Like, you represent us, you represent this family, you have a last name. Like, we call them boys all the time. We just call them boys. But when we differentiate with the last name. Philip Mendoza, Mikhail Mendoza, Jair Mendoza, because you are a Mendoza. Before you are a Jair, before you are a Philip, before you are a Mikhail, you are a Mendoza. We love that you're bringing your individuality, but we need you to understand that you're going out into the world as a representative of me and your father and of your community. And schools don't do that. You're just your first name. And you're lucky if you get a first name. You might just be a number. You might just be the kid of the moment who's getting on my nerves. And so from a psychological perspective, I think Black children are burning down their villages because they don't feel warm in them. And the part of that warmth is the communal understanding and the communal value of the individual. So for me, it's all about helping my kids understand who they are as a part of the community that their mother and father are, like Stacey said, choosing for them. And I do just want to give Stacey her props on that, because I think you gave a really great perspective in terms of socializing and what people don't understand about homeschooling. You can't get more social than homeschooling, because Black homeschoolers don't stay in the house. We go outside, we talk to people, we go to the grocery store. There are so many times where my kids had to sit there and play with some other kids in the grocery store because me and a mom was having a 2-hour conversation in aisle 3. I mean, making trucks out of cream of wheat. So I'm just saying that socializing is not what happens in a classroom with stations. Socializing is what happens when you're outside of 4 walls and you're actually in the community. And being the leader of Brown Mamas, I've had to help. It wasn't until my kids got older and people started to experience my kids that they were like, oh, that's what this is about. So from a psychological perspective, you can't find a better psychosocial setting or a stronger psychosocial setting for kids than the ones that their parents are choosing for them. Their educated and active parents are choosing for them.
I completely agree with everything that's been said. I'm also wondering if the psychological social factors include things like internalizing your own Black hate, Black racism. So I was not homeschooled, but my mama knew not to rely on the public school to give me all that knowledge that I would need to go out into this world. So she made sure I knew much more than what they taught about slavery in school and what they taught about, Martin Luther King. Those are like the things that the curriculum focuses on, and not necessarily in a good way. But my mom made sure I knew about Black firsts, the things that people have done, Black leaders in this world, Black contributions to the building of America and to the world. And I'm so grateful for her for doing that, because of that, I went from my predominantly white K-12 experience. I only applied to one undergrad school, and that was Hampton University. I knew I had to be among my people, because what my mama was telling me about the power of being Black and the beauty of being Black was not what I was seeing in these white schools. And I needed to go find a place where I could experience what my mama was talking about for myself. And she knew why I was picking Hampton. I had to go to Hampton. I don't know why specifically Hampton, but that was the one. But I knew I had to be in a Black environment, but my mom put that in my head. So even as any kind of parent today in this society, we've got to guard against having our children internalize the racism that they experience. That it's so important. And Black homeschooling, Black deschooling is a powerful avenue for that one purpose. I think also the psychological is this sense of you're less than. As parents, if we don't interfere with that, our children will think that they can't do. And we've got to as parents, get them to push through this sense of I can't do, so that they can see that they can do.
Mhm.
And I think those are the types of things, when I think psychologically, the kids today, that only have public schooling and they don't have anything else to get them out. You know, my mom sent me to a Black Saturday school experience also, right? I don't hear too much about those, but we need those. But again, if we don't have these avenues, our children will not know what they're capable of.
Mhm.
And if they don't understand, if they don't get experiences outside of the public school to show them and help them to see this, I think it's very, very critical. My kids, I did not homeschool my kids because I didn't know I could. That's really the only reason why. But I was like my mom, engaged in their learning. And we had what did we call it? A homeschool. I can't remember the name of it, but we got a bunch of Black professors and their children. We were talking about the lack of in our that our children were not getting this. And one of the things they weren't getting is public speaking. So we created this old school homeschool, that's what we called it, where they had to investigate a topic. And then every month they had to come before the parents and do a presentation based on what they learned. And we were getting on them about the and the stop saying like and stop saying and getting them to be able to present. And then, and then our children go on and that's what they're doing for a living. A lot of them are having to give public speaking, but they didn't get that experience in the public school. That was because of the old school homeschool that we created, right? So, I mean, parents you've got to look at what they're not getting and we've got to help with that. If not, it'll mess up their minds. And the kids today, they check out of school as early as kindergarten. Yeah. This ain't the place for me. I'm always in trouble.
Right. I hate school.
I hate school.
Right.
And the law in Georgia says as soon as they turn 16, they don't have to go anymore. And you know what? You know how I learned that law? A fourth grader told me. And they told me, I see them check, they're not in school and they're okay. I don't need school. That's the message that they get. So we need our parents to interject. Yes, you do need school, and help them overcome, give them new environments to learn in, the right kind that will work for them.
Panelists, you all have provided me with much information, and I hope that the same has been for anybody who's taken the time to be in attendance of today's session. What I see is that we really needed one more hour, because I think we may have gotten through half of our questions. But that said, I want to thank you all for providing your expertise, your experiential knowledge, your passion, and much insight on something that I think many of us need to know more about, as Muffy said, with respect to this loophole, so that it can become our so-called cheat code in order to ensure that our young people are successful in ways beyond what has been engineered for them. So again, I want to thank you all, and please, if you can, if you have the time before we adjourn, can you drop your emails in the chat for the audience in the event that they want to reach out to you after this session? So please, let's show some love for our panelists, and I want to thank you all for your expertise.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's nice seeing everyone, Dr. Smith and Muffy and Walter. Nice meeting you. Nice to meet you, Dr. Benson.
Nice meeting you as well.
Yes, nice to be here. Thank you so much for the space.
Absolutely. Thank you all.